I'm here today joined with Will Malz, the CEO and founder of OC4. He holds a number of AWS certifications and is an AWS expert in a number of different fields. He's particular expert in the security field of AWS, which is what I want to talk about today. So thank you for joining me today, Will.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Stuart.
No problem at all. So we met up last week in reInvent, which was a crazy week. There was lots of new announcements. So we met on the Monday before the keynote with Andy Jassy. And to kick off, I just want to talk about some of the security announcements that are made, starting with the IAM Access Analyzer. And this looks like it's a new service or feature to look at policies to see if they're more exposed than people may have thought. So can you talk us through the services, give us a kind of high-level overview of it and what your thoughts are on that?
IAM Access Analyzer is a really interesting new offering by AWS. The biggest thing about it is what we're doing is we're taking something that was traditionally a manual process, and the problem with it is when you're dealing with all the different components that we have to look at for our dealing with access management, when we're looking at VPC flow logs, when we're looking at CloudTrail logs, when we're looking at the way different aspects of the system are accessed, those logs are very verbose and they're enormous, and sometimes finding the diamond in the data is difficult to do when you know you've got issues. A lot of times too, from a regulatory compliance and audit standpoint, these things tend to get overlooked. They get reviewed at best quarterly, oftentimes annually, and probably most often of all, not at all. And that can be a real problem because you can get what we like to call permission creep. So moving into the whole IAM Access Analyzer, it's really interesting. It's part of what Amazon calls the provable security model, which is very quiet and gained in publicity, I guess is the best way to say it, in the last year or so. Yeah, there was a session called SEC 330 at reInvent 2018, which was titled Automating Compliance Certification with Automated Mathematical Proofs, which honestly was a lot more exciting than the title sounds. But it actually, the interesting thing was a year ago, the majority of the ways in which we were getting to mathematical proofs of this, and Amazon actually has a team that does the whole mathematical proof and algorithm development, and it's someone you'll never see or meet. But we were using third-party tools to generate the artifacts that were then applied to the algorithm to determine if you were, in compliance or if there was a security issue, et cetera. A lot of that tooling has now been internalized inside of Amazon, and that's really a compelling point, because aggregating all the disparate data points that you need to determine how your access is, it's a lot of times it's not as simple as a single IAM policy. It's not as simple as a single user or a single group. You can have cross-account roles. You can have items that allow kind of the creep of permissions over time. It's a one-off change where someone needs access for one day, but you forget to change it back, et cetera. Those things become readily apparent when we're dealing with the Access Analyzer. So
is that what it kind of focuses on, more the cross-account access and federated access, those kind of exposures?
Yeah, I mean, it's really what it comes down to is it's trying to get to that core principle of the security model for Amazon, where we have the principle of least privilege. Mm-hmm. So what we want to do is take a look at the mathematical proof, which it sounds crazy that you can actually prove something mathematically around security, but you can if you take a look at every which way someone can do something, or it actually comes into play with another thing that I'm sure we're going to talk about later. But if you look at every path into a system, you can then determine, okay, who has access in which scenario, and it may be scenarios that humans don't think of. So when we can do that programmatically, it becomes really compelling. And the fact that we're sitting here and we're integrating the new service here, we can do outputs to S3, so you can do your own log analysis if you want to put it up in Sumo or Splunk or any other third party. It integrates with IAM itself. Obviously, that's going to be one of the panes of glass. But then also they're tying it into Security Hub, and Security Hub, despite all the hoopla around it over the last year and everything, it's still a maturing product. And this is going to be a key piece of making that a lot more valuable of a product. ultimately, Security Hub is going to become a pane of glass through which you can view how you're doing, not only from a security standpoint, but ultimately from a regulatory compliance standpoint as well. And it's going to be something that's going to be a place where you can have audit information and information about the state of your system at any given time. So this is a very important piece of how we're going to be dealing with this. And there's some, especially in the United States, there's some huge regulatory laws that are already in effect or coming into effect in the next calendar year that this is going to be a key component of dealing with in terms of checking the box and passing with the auditors.
So it's something certainly that's worth investigating internally within your organization to kind of implement and use going forward.
Yeah, I think so. As Amazon keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, the challenge becomes, how do we manage this? It's funny, I've been doing this for a very long time. I remember where there were only 3 services on AWS, and
that is a long time.
Now we're, yeah, I might have still had hair at that point, but the thing that's really interesting about it is no one can know everything. It's you do this all day, every day, and there are entire products in Amazon that even people like me who deal with this all day, every day, I've never touched certain products. And it's not just the obvious ones like Ground Station where, I just haven't had an occasion to hook up a satellite. But,
strange that.
There's plenty, oddly enough. But, there's entire services that just don't play in the space that you're using or the method you're using. So getting Amazon to do native tooling around components like this is going to make it a lot easier. And it's decoupling it irrespective of your use case. It's decoupling how you analyze your access to any aspect of AWS, not just your storage or your compute or anything. It's actually analyzing how am I allowing my users to use any of my services without having to be an expert in that service, so you understand the way in which the service is being used. So that's going to be critical for the CISO office and your regulatory compliance, your attorneys, to get that pane of glass to take a look at that.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for that rundown. It makes it a lot clearer, and hopefully a lot of other people understand the kind of process behind it and kind of why we should implement it as well, which is great. So you mentioned Security Hub, which is obviously a single pane of glass approach to help identify potential security threats, along with Macy and Guard Duty, etc. Now, also announced was another service, Amazon Detective, and this seems to look deeper into the world of security and logging, etc. Do you think this kind of emphasizes how important a specialist security team is within your organization to have the understanding of how to take in all this data and interpret it and understand kind of the output that's being given by Amazon Detective? Because it seems like another deeper layer offered by AWS, and it really kind of highlights security as a whole.
100%. Yeah, 100%. This one, the first thing that jumped into my head when I looked at this one, and I was talking about, new laws in the states that are dealing with, basically there's 2 laws that are coming up for enforcement in the United States that are going to have a massive impact in the next year from a security and regulatory compliance standpoint. Okay. And the thing about the first one, the thing about them both is they don't just affect the states in which the law was made. They actually affect if you have a consumer in that state. So basically, if you have a consumer in the United States, the 2 states that put these laws into effect are California and New York. It's highly probable you're going to have a user in California or New York. So these laws really apply to anybody. So the first one is something that's referred to as NYDFS 500. It's the New York Department of Financial Services. It's Rule 500 basically, and that one deals mostly with financial services data. And then there's another one called CCPA, which is the California Consumer Protection Act. Effectively, CCPA is really like GDPR for the United States.
Okay.
And like California often does, it's leading the country in this way. And by making it so that if you have any customer in that state, it effectively becomes a national law. NYC DFS and NYDFS 500, or it's also called 23 NYCRR 500. Those deal specifically with financial services. So with the 2 of them, they're both coming into effect. Honestly, the New York DFS 500 has been in effect since last year, but there's been a bit of a grace period to allow companies to get up to speed. It requires companies to have significant postures around the way they're dealing with cybersecurity and their data in those data sets in terms of financial services. The state of New York has hired, not fired, a the state of New York has hired a former United States district attorney to head the program in New York. And the word on Wall Street and inside of New York City is that they expect enforcement actions to be coming in 2020. And so that has a lot of people up in arms. And additionally, the CCPA is critical. So moving on in the specifics of how we were talking about detective, I think this is probably, I don't think people get excited about security much, but this is probably the most significant thing that was announced in terms of new products at reInvent this year. The biggest thing it does is it automates the ETL, the extract, transform, and load of things that are, again, as I was talking about in the previous question, VPC flow logs, crowd trail logs, guard duty, et cetera. It allows you to pull that data out and then correlate that data in a way that's very hard for humans to do, just because those logs are so verbose and there's so much data in there. And finding the diamonds in that data is
time consuming.
It's a nightmare. And so what it really does is it allows you, one of the things you and I talked about is, the concept of specialized security teams and how large companies managed those components. And the problem you have there is you have turnover and it costs a lot of money. So bringing this down to the point where it is almost anywhere, any man can understand it, any person can understand it, makes it a very compelling piece of software. So one of the key points we see with AWS Detective is that it shows that Amazon has an understanding that the posture of the market is that the grace period for regulatory enforcement and the way that the new rules are going to be enforced is effectively over. Enforcement is going to be a reality going forward. So Amazon is providing the tooling to allow their customers to succeed, especially their customers that are in highly regulated verticals. Now, that's not to say it's only to play inside of highly regulated verticals. It's to play anywhere. As we all know, data is king, and the more data you have, the more you can find out. And sometimes we can use data in ways that we never even intended and find diamonds inside that data that give us insights, et cetera. So
Sure. I mean, it certainly sounds like these new security features and services announced are really going to help with those governance and compliance and certifications that need to be achieved, especially with them being managed services. It just makes it so much easier for organizations to use and interpret. But at the same time, I guess those teams still need an element of knowledge of how to still interpret those results of these services to then put factors in place to kind of remediate any security threats.
Yeah, I agree with all of that completely. And the thing is, you're starting to see it move up the chain, at least in the States. You're seeing, we've got New York and California taking it seriously, and I can send you a link on this. But just the other day, the Office of the Comptroller of Currency for the United States actually gave a quote that said the use of innovative and evolving technology and progressive data analysis capabilities, those were identified as key risks to the U.S. federal banking system. So the awareness of this is moving up the chain. Even though the lawmakers oftentimes don't know what it is they're regulating, at least they're taking a good hard look at what they're doing.
It's been noticed more for sure.
So one more thing to add on in the concept of the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency is that one of the things we've been hearing in the last basically day is that there's rumors in the last 24, 48 hours of another massive U.S. financial services data breach. From what we're hearing out on the street, when this comes to light, it's supposedly bigger than the Equifax breach. So wow. That is probably going to lead to significantly increased enforcement actions and regulatory audits, et cetera, going forward in 2020 and beyond.
Well, that will be interesting to see how that plays out. So based on kind of data breaches and access, etc., there was another element that I wanted to discuss, and that's S3 access points. Now, S3 has been thrown into the limelight of security a number of times over the years for data breaches, etc., but much of that was down to not understanding how to control access within S3 more than anything else.
Yep.
AWS have been adding new features to help control that with the blocking public access by default to S3 buckets, etc. But they've just brought out S3 access points, which looks to try and simplify overcomplicated bucket policies where you can have a single bucket policy that has numerous statements in, and over time this can get bigger and bigger for different access required by different resources. And this seems to be replaced, well, not replaced, but used in conjunction with access points, which seems to make things simpler to control.
Yep.
Are you able to provide a couple of scenarios where you would use these access points to help manage your security to objects within buckets?
Yeah, sure. Just kind of going into it real quick from a high level. The thing with S3, Amazon's almost a victim of its own success. I mean, S3 is one of the oldest, core services that we have on Amazon, but it effectively gives you infinite storage inside, object storage inside of a given bucket. And a lot of customers have gone to the point where they'll use a bucket or, a couple nested buckets or what have you, a bucket with nested folders in it to store the vast majority of their data. And the problem is that you end up with, you attempt to restrict the access to that, and it becomes very tricky as you move forward, whether it's, I only want to allow access to a given prefix or to a given folder inside of the bucket, or even just to some subset of data, or even control, whether it's read or read write or the way that you want to go around it. So one of the things that was introduced was bucket policies to allow that control and the way you access it. The problem is we've got large data sets across a bucket, across a couple of different buckets, effectively data lakes, or just some place where you've been aggregating data for a long time. Making modifications to the bucket policies on there can become problematic because you could potentially impact production or existing systems. Whereas from the standpoint of moving on to the access points, right, we can give a distinct, uniquely named endpoint, and we can constrain that to a given VPC so that access can only originate from a given VPC. We can also constrain it to an external account ID. So if you're doing cross-account access into a data lake or into a large bucket, you can say this endpoint is only accessible from this external account and nowhere else. Another really key point, and this kind of ties back to the whole thing we were talking about earlier with Security Hub and how that's maturing and how the whole standpoint on audit and those components is maturing. Something we haven't really touched on is AWS organizations and SCP's security control policies. So the S3 access points, and I suspect we're going to see this going forward with a lot of new offerings, is going to be natively integrated with organizations and with SCPs. So
you can filter at that top level to start with.
That's exactly right. You can go with the permissive model, or you can go with the inherent deny model. So the ability to inherently, deny, and then allow as you move further down the chain to the specific application or the specific account in which you're in is a critical way to avoid that type of oversight where you accidentally make data public that you didn't intend to, or you allow an application to have access where it shouldn't, something like a SQL injection or anything where you end up overflowing a web server and getting access in a way you shouldn't. Having those types of effectively guardrails on the edges used in organizations and SCPs is really going to be compelling for a lot of organizations. I think one of the challenges with this is a lot of companies already have quite a large amount of adoption of S3, and modifying it to use access points and the way we control it is going to be a challenge, in that it's going to take some effort to make the modification. So it's something that I expect newer customers to adopt to quickly, and I expect legacy customers and legacy in cloud speak. So in the last couple of years, customers and customers that have been longer than that, it will probably take them a little longer to adopt to that. And part of that also, especially as it pertains to SCPs, is the fact that the way organizations is structured, and we can't bring existing accounts under organizations as easily as we can create new accounts. That becomes a real interesting challenge from an operational and security standpoint, honestly, the best practice would probably be to tear down your old environment, move everything to a new account, and get everything in line. But that's not without pain. And I think we're actually getting to that point overall with cloud, where it's time to take a look at our foundational methods and the way we built things, not only just the account, but also how are the VPCs set up? What are we doing with peering? What are we doing with cross-account roles? Can we benefit from AWS organizations and security control policies? Can we benefit from some of the new features? With a lot of our customers, what we've seen is that it's starting to become a best practice to reinvent all of their account structure and move to organizations, implement SCPs, et cetera. And what that does is it forces a reevaluation of the way you're using certain aspects of AWS. But one of the other things that we found is that when you're doing a move like that, it's not simply a pick it up and move standpoint. You actually need to evaluate everything. So one of the things that we spend a lot of time on when we're doing that is on IAM policies and the way we're going about it, and also on S3 and S3 bucket policies. So in moving to new accounts to take advantage of new AWS technologies, we actually end up doing a security and access audit anyway. And I think S3 access points really ends up being something that's going to be recommended along the process, is saying, okay, you've got this enormous S3 bucket or this set of S3 buckets that's the majority of your data. How are we accessing that? And then should we be constraining it differently? If there were to be, what you actually asked me, and I still haven't answered, is what could I see us using it for? So, in an n-tiered application, you could potentially have multiple components that need access to S3 data. And some of it could just be really simple stuff like CloudFront needing static assets to present. That's simple enough to do, but if you can give that a dedicated endpoint, that's all well and good, especially if it's user-driven content that you're resizing or something of that nature.
And that endpoint will just have its own simple policy for that specific application or resource.
Precisely, yeah. Yep. And you can control the granularity of that as well. But then there's other aspects of it. Let's say you're doing some ETL, loading things into Redshift, things of that nature. You may need different sets of data, or you may be writing results from an EMR activity out to an S3 bucket. The permissions, versus read versus write, for example, if we're loading into Redshift instead of writing in via an EMR use case, there's different permissions there. So you can have different endpoints. And what that really is going to do, that's also an interesting thing, is it's going to allow us to have a better granularity on the audit, which is going to be critical when we're actually talking about AWS Detective and the things we've already spoken about.
Sure.
So it's going to give you, because you're going to be accessing a unique endpoint, it's actually going to give you a better granularity of view. And you're going to say this endpoint is only used by this application. So, okay, who hit this and why? That should only be that app. And if you see a permission that's not a component of that, you can quickly address it, identify it, and remediate it. So that's a pretty big win in my regard. And as you can see, a lot of this stuff kind of is starting to mesh together, even just in a very, very early view.
And it seems to all be becoming more simplified as well. So simplification, easy to manage, kind of single pane of glass view, integration with other services. It's just starting to, like you say, mesh together a lot easier to understand how it's all put together.
Yeah, and in the classic model of moving across, and you have your early adapters, and then you have the crossing the chasm moment, and then you have mainstream adoption. I feel like we're just past crossing the chasm, and tools like this are necessary to really get the mainstream adoption. The number one buying objection has always been fear, uncertainty, and doubt about, okay, I don't even know where my data is going. How am I going to secure my data? And over the last 5 years or so, we've had a lot of moves on that. We've had KMS, and you can bring your own key to KMS, and there's different solutions around the way you're managing your HSM and things of that nature. But the ability to give the C-level suite, the C-suite, that pane of glass where you can look at it and say, it's not quite as simple as green, yellow, red, but it is pretty close, at least compared to where we were in the way it's moved. So we can continue to improve on that and give the C-suite that level of comfort. I think that's going to help AWS continue to drive adoption going forward.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Will. There's a wealth of information there. So thanks for breaking down the security releases and features from reInvent. It's been great chatting with you. I have one more question. What was your highlight from reInvent this year? Because I think you've been to all of them so far. So what was your highlight from this year? Was there a particular event, particular service, particular something?
It's funny. I have a running joke with a couple guys in my company that I shouldn't even buy a badge to reInvent anymore because all I do is run around and meet with people. I don't get to go to the session as I used to. But I do watch the keynotes. I do keep a pretty close eye on what's coming out. And personally, for me, I would honestly say Detective was the most exciting exciting announcement that we had out there. I started kicking the tires on it. I haven't gotten very deep on it because honestly, still, even though it's Thursday after reInvent, I think I'm still recovering a bit.
Yeah, it was a heavy week.
It's a heavy week, and it goes so fast, and then the time zone shifts and all that other stuff.
Thank you very much for your insights, and hopefully we can do this again sometime soon. Talk about more security services, more features, and speak to you again soon.
I'd love to. Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much for your time, Will. Cheers.
All right. Bye-bye.